All right, so we're diving into Ukraine today,
Hmm.
a deep dive into all these different ideas about how to end the war there, leaked plans, expert analysis. Even some people are talking about like a Marshall Plan kind of rebuild. It's a lot.
It really is. And one of the most interesting things is how complicated it actually is to end a war, like a real lasting peace, not just a ceasefire.
Yeah, it's not just about stopping the fighting, is it?
Exactly.
Speaking of stopping the fighting, there's that leaked peace plan, supposedly from Trump. Newsweek even picked it up. What do you make of that?
Well, it was a Ukrainian outlet, Strana, that said they had the details, this whole 100-day plan. But the thing is, even if it's real, just the fact that it was leaked could totally backfire.
You think so?
Oh, yeah. Zelensky and Putin might just reject it out of hand, just because of how it looks, the optics of it all.
It's like the leak itself becomes part of the information war, even if the plan's not legit.
Exactly.
And Tim White, that journalist, he was saying there's no proof it's even a real plan
Mm.
in 100 Days to Peace. Come on, that's to put it mildly, yeah.
It shows you how hard this is. It's like you can't just put a Band-Aid on a gaping wound.
Right.
A ceasefire, that's one thing. But a lasting peace, you've got to deal with the reasons why they were fighting in the first place, or it'll just flare up again.
It's like a Band-Aid over a bullet hole almost.
Right. Exactly.
So it's not just Trump trying to make peace here. Al Jazeera, they were talking about all these different plans from China, Brazil, even some African nations are getting involved.
Yeah, and that's where that European Parliament analysis is so interesting. They looked at all these plans, and a lot of them, they're more focused on just a ceasefire, not an actual lasting peace.
Isn't a ceasefire a good place to start, though? At least the killing stops.
Oh, for sure. Stopping the violence is huge. But what the European Parliament says is for peace to really stick, it needs what they call national ownership.
Okay, what's that mean?
It means it can't be forced on them by outsiders. It has to come from inside Ukraine. They have to be the ones building their own future.
That makes sense. I mean, it's their country, their lives.
Yeah.
Which kind of leads us to the Kiev Security Compact, that KSC thing. That's their vision for how things should be after the war, right?
Exactly. It's how they see themselves being safe. And a big part of that is making sure they can defend themselves. Think of it like building up a shield so they're not vulnerable again, whether it's Russia or anyone else.
So that's where those G7 security guarantees come in, those promises from other countries to help them out with military stuff, economic aid, all that.
Exactly. It's not just about helping them survive, it's about helping them thrive. And there's that interesting part in the KSC. It's called a snapback sanctions clause.
Snapback sanctions.
Yeah, so if Russia attacks again, boom, sanctions automatically come back.
That's got to be a strong message. Makes them think twice, right?
Definitely a deterrent.
So we're talking about long-term solutions here, and there's this idea gaining some traction, this modern-day Marshall Plan for Ukraine.
Yeah, and the German Marshall Fund, they make a really strong argument for why this approach could actually be a smart investment, not just for Ukraine, but for the whole world.
A Marshall Plan for Ukraine.
Yeah.
I mean, rebuilding Europe after World War II. That's a massive undertaking. How does that even apply here?
Well, think about what Ukraine's facing right now. Infrastructure wrecked, the economy's a mess, millions of people have had to leave their homes, rebuilding from all that. I mean, that's going to take a massive effort, something huge, like what the Marshall Plan did.
So this isn't just some one-time aid package. We're talking long-term commitment.
Exactly, and it goes beyond just rebuilding stuff. The German Marshall Fund, they say, a modern Marshall Plan, it should also focus on strengthening Ukraine's institutions, making their government work better, helping their economy grow. It's about building back better, making a Ukraine that's stronger and more prosperous than before.
That's a big goal. I want to go back to those other peace plans we were talking about, though. You said the European Parliament, they had some concerns about them, right? What were they worried about?
So they looked into those alternative proposals and they saw some red flags. Take China's plan. It's all about a ceasefire, starting political talks, but it doesn't really address the underlying issues that caused the conflict in the first place.
Yeah, you can't just sweep those under the rug.
Right. And there's this weird emphasis on opposing military blocs expanding, which, given NATO's role in supporting Ukraine, it seems kind of pointed, don't you think?
Almost like China's more interested in helping Russia than Ukraine.
It's a perspective we need to think about, for sure. Then there's that African Peace Initiative. Their main focus is the humanitarian stuff, getting those grain exports moving again.
Yeah, it makes sense. A lot of African countries depend on that Ukrainian grain.
Right. But the question is, are they actually concerned about a lasting peace for Ukraine, or is it more about protecting their own interests? That's what the European Parliament is worried about.
So is it even realistic to think Ukraine can just dictate the terms of peace? when they're relying so much on help from other countries? I mean, they need those allies.
That's the tough part. It's a balancing act. The report points out that some of these alternative plans, they're kind of vague on important stuff like Russia pulling their troops out and giving Ukraine back its territory. They're not specific enough.
Yeah, I don't see Ukraine compromising on those things. So that brings us back to the Kyiv Security Compact and those G7 guarantees. Those seem more like what Ukraine wants.
Absolutely. The KSC and those guarantees, they're a real framework for making that vision happen, defending themselves, rebuilding their country.
But even with all that help, rebuilding a whole country, that's a huge task. It takes more than just money. Strategy, coordination, long-term commitment.
Right. And that's why the German Marshall Fund's argument for a Marshall Plan is so interesting. They're not talking about just one country leading the charge this time. It would be the EU, international financial institutions, a whole bunch of countries working together.
That sounds like a lot of cooks in the kitchen. Have we ever seen this kind of international cooperation work on this scale before?
Well, look at the original Marshall Plan. That was the U.S. sending a ton of resources to Europe after the war, but it also took a lot of work from the European countries themselves, coordinating with each other. And in the end, it worked, helped rebuild Europe and stopped the spread of communism.
So the Marshall Plan is like the gold standard for this kind of thing.
Exactly. And the German Marshall Fund, they think the same approach could work for Ukraine. With enough countries working together, backing them up, they could not only rebuild Ukraine, but also make Eastern Europe more stable, which helps everyone.
Sounds like a win-win. We're talking about all these solutions, but there's still a war going on. What's the latest on the ground?
Yeah, and we can't forget about that. People are suffering while all this diplomacy is happening. The Razumkov Centre report, that really hit home for me.
What did they say? Well, they talked about how this war is changing Ukrainian society. Like people are using the Ukrainian language way more. Now it's a huge cultural shift.
It is, yeah. It shows how strong their national identity is becoming, facing this huge threat. It's not just language, their whole society is changing. I mean, think about it. The government has to make these really tough decisions about military service, the economy. How do you keep the country running while you're fighting a war?
It's like trying to fix a car while you're driving it.
Yeah, kind of.
Yeah.
And we can't forget about the effects this war is having on the rest of the world. Zelensky, in his UN speech, he called it a global crisis. He's not wrong. This war has messed up global supply chains, and now we have this cost of living crisis. Everything's getting so expensive, it's hitting people all over the world.
And then there's energy prices going through the roof. Russia's basically using energy as a weapon.
Right. And Zelensky's point is that this makes basic necessities like a luxury only rich people can afford. He even wants the world to call Russia a state sponsor of terrorism. That's a big deal.
Yeah, he's not holding back. And he talked about the environmental damage, too. All that contaminated land, millions of animals dead. This war is affecting so much more than just Ukraine.
Yeah, even if the fighting stopped tomorrow, it would take years to rebuild and heal.
So we've covered a lot here. Different peace plans, the challenges of rebuilding the global impact. For someone listening to this, trying to understand it all, what are the key takeaways?
I think the most important thing to remember is that this war isn't just happening over there, it's affecting all of us. It shows how easily peace can be broken, how connected our world is, and how important international relations are.
It definitely makes you think. And it shows that supporting democracy and standing up to bullies like Russia is more important than ever.
Absolutely. And as things develop, we need to stay informed, stay engaged, and keep working for a real and lasting peace in Ukraine.
It's easy to feel overwhelmed by something this big and complex, but like we're doing here, learning about it is a good start. Maybe, just maybe as awful as this war is, it could push us to think differently about global security. Find ways to actually prevent these conflicts from happening in the first place. That's something to think about as we try to make sense of all this.